Rome, 455 AD. The Eternal City, the beating heart of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known, lay open. No walls could stop what was coming. No army stood in the way. And for 14 days, a people that history would never forgive swept through its streets, its palaces, and its temples, and took everything that was not nailed down. Their name was the Vandals. And from that single moment, 14 days in the summer of 455, the entire legacy of a people stretching back centuries was reduced to one word. A word that, to this day, we use to describe the senseless destruction of things we hold dear. Vandalism. A word born from a reputation. A reputation built, as we shall see, on far shakier ground than most people realize. But here is the thing that history rarely tells you. The Vandals were not the mindless destroyers that popular imagination has made them out to be. They were not a faceless horde of chaos and savagery crashing blindly through a civilized world. They were a people with a homeland, a language, a faith, and a destiny that carried them further across the known world than almost any other group of their era. From the frozen shores of Scandinavia, across the breadth of Europe, through the mountains of Spain, and across the Mediterranean Sea into the sun-baked plains of North Africa. The journey of the Vandals is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary sagas of the ancient world. They built a kingdom. They commanded a navy. They challenged emperors. And for nearly a century, they ruled one of the most strategically vital pieces of territory in the entire Mediterranean basin. So who were the Vandals, really? Where did they come from? How did a Germanic people from the northern fringes of Europe end up as masters of North Africa, with the city of Carthage as their crown jewel? And how did they fall, swiftly, completely, and almost without a trace? These are the questions we are going to answer. Every chapter of this story, from their shadowy origins in the ancient north to their dramatic and final destruction at the hands of a Byzantine general, will be examined with the seriousness this people deserve. A people who have been mischaracterized for over 15 centuries and are long overdue for a proper reckoning. This is the full history of the Vandals. And it begins, as all great stories do, at the very beginning. To understand the Vandals, we must travel back to a time long before the sacking of Rome, long before the kingdom in North Africa, long before the word vandalism entered any language. We must go back to the cold, forested landscapes of northern Europe, where the story of this people quietly begins. The Vandals were a Germanic people, part of that vast constellation of tribes and groups who inhabited the regions beyond the reach of Roman civilization. Ancient sources, including the Roman writer Pliny the Elder and the historian Tacitus, place the early Vandals in the area of modern-day southern Scandinavia and the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, a region that corresponds roughly to parts of modern Poland and northern Germany. There is even a region in Sweden called Vendel, and a district in Silesia historically associated with the name Vandal, which gives us tantalizing geographical anchors for their earliest homeland. The Vandals were not a single unified people, but were broadly divided into two main groupings, the Hasding Vandals and the Siling Vandals. These two groups shared a common ethnic and linguistic heritage, both speaking an East Germanic language, but they operated largely as separate entities for much of their early history, often appearing in different regions and under different circumstances in the ancient sources. It is the Hasdings who would ultimately prove the more historically significant of the two, as it is they who would eventually lead the Vandals into North Africa and establish the Vandal kingdom. Like most Germanic peoples of this period, the Vandals of the early centuries were a semi-nomadic tribal society. They were warriors, farmers, and herdsmen. They organized themselves around kinship groups and were led by kings and chieftains whose authority was bound up in military prowess and the loyalty of their fighting men. They worshipped the gods of the Germanic tradition, and like their neighbors, they lived in a world defined by seasonal rhythms, tribal alliances, and the constant pressure of neighboring peoples. The Romans were aware of the Vandals from relatively early on. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Roman writers were already documenting them as one of the many peoples dwelling beyond the Danube frontier. And it is here, at the edge of the Roman world, that the Vandals first begin to emerge from the shadows of prehistory and into the light of recorded history. They appear not as invaders at this stage, but simply as one group among many living in the vast and complex world that existed beyond Rome's borders. But that world was about to be set in motion. Forces were building in the east, the westward movement of the Huns among others, that would eventually push the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe into one another and into the Roman Empire itself. And the Vandals, like so many others, would be swept up in this great tide of movement and displacement that historians call the migration period, or what the Germans call the Völkerwanderung, the wandering of the peoples. Their long journey was about to begin. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the world that the Vandals had known for generations was beginning to shift beneath their feet. The vast plains and forests of Central and Eastern Europe were becoming increasingly unstable, as peoples from further east began pressing westward with growing intensity. The Roman Empire, for its part, was no longer the unassailable monolith it had once been. It was stretched thin, politically fractured, and increasingly dependent on Germanic warriors to fill the ranks of its own armies. The stage was being set for one of the most consequential periods of population movement in the history of the ancient world. The Vandals' first significant appearance in the historical record as a people on the move comes in the 3rd century AD, when both the Hasding and Siling Vandals began pushing southward toward the Danube, the great river that formed one of Rome's primary frontier boundaries. This brought them into direct contact and direct conflict with the Roman Empire. The Hasdings in particular pressed into the Roman province of Dacia, the region corresponding to modern-day Romania, and the Romans found themselves forced to respond militarily on more than one occasion. These early encounters were a preview of what was to come, a recurring pattern of pressure, conflict, negotiation, and uneasy accommodation that would define the relationship between the Vandals and Rome for the next 2 centuries. At various points during this period, the Vandals also entered into arrangements with Rome that were common along the frontier, agreements in which Germanic peoples were permitted to settle within or near Roman territory in exchange for military service. Many Vandals served in Roman armies during the 3rd and 4th centuries, and this experience was not insignificant. It gave them direct exposure to Roman military organization, tactics, and logistics. It gave them a familiarity with the empire from the inside, knowledge that would prove valuable in the centuries to come. Then came the Huns. Erupting out of the eastern steppes in the latter half of the 4th century, the Huns were a formidable and terrifying force. Their arrival sent shockwaves through the entire barbarian world of Central and Eastern Europe. People after people were displaced, pushed westward and southward by the relentless advance of the Hunnic Confederation. The Goths, the Alans, the Burgundians, and many others were set in motion. And among those caught up in this great human tide were the Vandals. By the late 4th and very early 5th centuries, the pressure had become overwhelming. The Vandals, both the Hasdings and the Silings, were being pushed ever further westward, hemmed in by the Huns to the east and by other displaced peoples all around them. They forged alliances where they could. The Hasding Vandals, in particular, allied themselves with a non-Germanic Iranian people called the Alans, a relationship that would endure for decades and would ultimately cross continents with them. This alliance was not merely a marriage of convenience. It was a survival strategy, a joining of forces by peoples who understood that the world was changing and that only the strong and the organized would survive the transition. The Vandals were moving, and the direction they were moving in led directly toward the heart of the Roman world. The last day of December, 406 AD, is one of those dates that historians return to again, and for good reason. It was a moment that changed the trajectory of the Western Roman Empire, and it was a moment in which the Vandals played a central and dramatic role. The Rhine River, running along the northwestern frontier of the Roman Empire, had for centuries served as one of the great symbolic and practical boundaries of the Roman world. On one side lay the ordered, taxed, administered world of Rome. On the other lay the world of the Germanic peoples, free, fluid, and beyond Roman control. The Rhine was not merely a river. It was a statement of where Rome ended and where everything else began. And on that last day of 406, during one of the most brutal winters in recent memory, the river froze solid. What happened next was, by any measure, one of the most consequential border crossings in the history of the ancient world. A massive coalition of peoples, Vandals, both Hasdings and Silings, along with their Alan allies and the Suebi, another Germanic group, poured across the frozen Rhine into the Roman province of Gaul. The Roman forces stationed along that frontier were insufficient to stop them. The crossing was not a clean, organized military maneuver. It was a desperate mass movement of peoples, men, women, children, animals, and everything they owned, driven by the pressure building behind them and the possibility of survival ahead. The Romans had not left the Rhine entirely unguarded by choice. The political situation within the empire had, once again, created a crisis of priorities. A usurper named Constantine III had stripped much of the Rhine garrison of its troops to support his own bid for imperial power in Britain, leaving the frontier dangerously exposed at precisely the wrong moment. It was into this gap that the Vandals and their allies flooded. The entry of these peoples into Gaul unleashed a period of considerable violence and disruption. The Vandals, along with the Alans and the Suebi, moved through the province in a wave that Roman writers described with horror. Towns sacked, farmland stripped, populations displaced. Ancient sources such as the chronicler Prosper of Aquitaine and the cleric Jerome painted vivid and devastating pictures of the destruction that accompanied this crossing. It is worth noting, however, that such descriptions were written from a Roman perspective, by writers who viewed these events with understandable alarm and grief, and whose accounts were not always free from exaggeration or rhetorical embellishment. What is clear is that the Roman province of Gaul was profoundly disrupted. The Vandals and their allies were not moving through as tourists. They were a displaced people in motion, looking for land, for food, for security. And they took what they needed as they went. The Romans, for their part, were not entirely passive in the face of this incursion. There was fierce resistance in places, and the Hasding Vandals in particular suffered significant losses in fighting against another Germanic people, the Franks, who were allied with Rome and who attacked the Hasdings as they moved through the region. The Hasding king, Godegisel, was killed in this fighting, and the Hasdings were in serious danger of being destroyed entirely before the Alans intervened and relieved the pressure on them. It was a reminder of how precarious the situation was for the Vandals at this stage. They were not an unstoppable force confidently marching to destiny, but a people under enormous stress, fighting for their survival at every turn. After roughly 2 years of moving through Gaul, the Vandals and their allies pushed further south and west. The province could not sustain them indefinitely, and the pressure of Roman resistance and internal competition between the various barbarian groups made Gaul an increasingly untenable place to remain. Their eyes and their feet turned toward the Pyrenees, the mountain range that separated Gaul from the Iberian Peninsula. Beyond those mountains lay Hispania, and the possibility, however uncertain, of something more permanent. The Vandals were not done moving. Not by a long way. In the year 409 AD, the Vandals, along with their Alan allies and the Suebi, crossed the Pyrenees and entered the Iberian Peninsula, the vast landmass that today comprises Spain and Portugal. It was another extraordinary step in a journey that had already covered an astonishing distance, and it opened a new and critically important chapter in Vandal history. The crossing of the Pyrenees was not heavily contested. Roman control over the mountain passes was, at this point, too weak to mount an effective defense, and the barbarian coalition moved through into Hispania largely unimpeded. What greeted them on the other side was a wealthy, fertile, and relatively prosperous Roman province, one that had been part of the empire for centuries and had developed into one of its more productive and well-settled regions. For peoples who had been living in a state of constant movement and insecurity for years, Hispania must have appeared as something close to a promised land. The various groups that had crossed the Pyrenees together soon divided the peninsula among themselves, in what ancient sources describe as a partition carried out by lot. The Siling Vandals received the southern province of Boeotia, the region corresponding to modern-day Andalusia, one of the richest and most agriculturally productive areas of the entire peninsula. The Hasding Vandals were allocated Galicia in the northwest, the rugged region that today corresponds to Galicia in northwestern Spain and northern Portugal. The Alans received the central provinces of Lusitania and Carthaginiensis, while the Suebi settled alongside the Hasdings in the northwest. For a brief period, there was a degree of stability. The Vandals, for the first time in years, had land. They had territory they could call their own, at least in practice, if not in any formal legal sense recognized by Rome. The Siling Vandals in particular found themselves in comfortable circumstances in the fertile south, while the Hasdings worked to consolidate their hold on the northwest. But Rome was not prepared to simply accept this situation. The Western Emperor Honorius, operating from his secure base in Ravenna, deployed his most capable military commander, the general Flavius Constantius, later to become Emperor Constantius III, to address the barbarian presence in Hispania. Crucially, Rome's strategy was not to fight the Vandals directly with Roman legions, but to use other barbarians against them. The Visigoths, a Gothic people who had themselves recently settled in southwestern Gaul as federates of Rome, were directed into Hispania as Rome's instrument of policy. The results were devastating. particularly for the Siling Vandals. Between approximately 416 and 418 AD, the Visigoths campaigned aggressively through Hispania. The Siling Vandals in Boeotia were effectively destroyed as a coherent fighting force. Their king, Fredball, was captured and sent to the Roman court. The Alans fared little better. Their king, Adax, was killed in battle, and the Alans suffered such catastrophic losses that they ceased to exist as an independent people. The surviving Alans, in a remarkable act of submission, placed themselves under the authority of the Hasding Vandal king, Gunderic, asking to be incorporated into his people. From this point forward, the Hasding kings would carry the title King of the Vandals and the Alans, a title that persisted for the remainder of Vandal history and that reflected this moment of absorption and consolidation. The Siling survivors similarly gravitated toward the Hasdings, merging into what was now a reconstituted and unified Vandal people under Hasding leadership. The Vandals had entered Hispania as two separate groups among a coalition of several peoples. They would leave it as a single consolidated nation, forged by catastrophe and survival into something harder and more coherent than what had existed before. Under King Gunderic, the reunified Vandals moved southward from Galaetia, pushing into the richer territories of the south that the Silings had previously held. They established themselves in Boeotia and began, for the first time, to engage seriously with the sea. The southern coast of Hispania offered access to the Mediterranean, and the Vandals, a people who had originated in the landlocked forests of northern Europe, began raiding the Balearic Islands and the North African coast. It was a remarkable transformation, and it pointed toward something that no one could yet fully imagine. Gunderic died in 428 AD and was succeeded by his half-brother, a man who would become the most consequential ruler in Vandal history. His name was Gaiseric, and under his leadership, the Vandals were about to make the most audacious move of their entire extraordinary journey. Of all the remarkable figures who emerge from the story of the late Roman world, Gaiseric, also written as Gaiseric in some sources, stands among the most formidable. He was not a man who left much of himself behind in the historical record in personal terms. We have no detailed physical description that can be fully trusted, no collection of speeches or writings bearing his name. What we have instead is the record of what he did. And what he did was extraordinary by any standard of the ancient world. Gaiseric became king of the Vandals in 428 AD, succeeding his half-brother Gunderic under circumstances that ancient sources hint were not entirely clean. There are suggestions that Gaiseric may have had a hand in his brother's death, though this cannot be stated with certainty and must be treated with appropriate caution. What is certain is that from the moment he took power, Gaiseric demonstrated a quality of leadership that set him apart from virtually every other barbarian king of his era. He was calculating, patient, ruthless when necessary, and possessed of a strategic vision that consistently operated several steps ahead of his opponents. He was also, crucially, a man who understood opportunity. The opportunity that presented itself in 428 and 429 AD came from within the Roman Empire itself. The Western Roman province of North Africa, encompassing the territories of modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and western Libya, was governed at this time by a Roman general named Boniface. Boniface had become entangled in the savage internal politics of the Western Empire and found himself on the losing side of a power struggle at the imperial court in Ravenna. Ancient sources, most notably the historian Procopius writing a century later, record a tradition that Boniface invited the Vandals to cross into Africa, offering them land in exchange for military support against his enemies at court. Whether this invitation was as straightforward as the sources suggest is a matter of historical debate, and the details are difficult to verify with confidence. What is not in doubt is that Gaiseric recognized in the situation an opening that was too significant to ignore. In 429 AD, Gaiseric did something that had no precedent in Vandal history, and that must have seemed, to contemporary observers, almost inconceivable. He organized the entire Vandal people, men, women, children, the elderly, along with their Alan confederates and other associated groups, and transported them across the Strait of Gibraltar into Roman North Africa. Ancient sources, including Procopius, record the number of people who made this crossing as approximately 80,000, though modern historians treat this figure with caution, as ancient population numbers are notoriously unreliable. Whatever the precise number, it was a massive undertaking, an entire nation crossing a body of water, leaving behind the land they had held in Hispania, and committing themselves entirely and irrevocably to a new continent. The sheer logistical ambition of this crossing deserves a moment of reflection. The Vandals were a Germanic people from northern Europe. The sea was not their natural domain. And yet Gaiseric organized a maritime crossing of sufficient scale to move tens of thousands of people, and all that they carried with them, across the Strait of Gibraltar. It speaks to his organizational ability, to the discipline he had already instilled in his people, and to the extraordinary confidence, or perhaps the calculated desperation, that drove the decision. Once in North Africa, the Vandals moved eastward along the coast, through the Roman provinces of Mauritania and Numidia. Their passage was not peaceful. Towns were besieged, the countryside was plundered, and the local Roman population suffered considerably. Among the most significant moments of this westward march was the siege of the city of Hippo Regius, a major port city in what is today northeastern Algeria. Hippo Regius is a name that carries enormous weight in the history of Christianity, because it was the city in which St. Augustine served as bishop. Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in the history of the Christian Church, was present in Hippo Regius during the Vandal siege. He died there in August of 430 AD, while the city was still under siege, one of the most poignant intersections of religious and political history in the entire late antique period. Hippo Regius itself eventually fell to the Vandals in 431 AD. The Western Empire did not accept the Vandal advance without resistance. A Roman force, reinforced by troops sent from the Eastern Empire, engaged the Vandals in battle, but was defeated. Negotiations followed, and in 435 AD, a formal treaty was concluded between Gaiseric and the Western Roman Empire, in which the Vandals were recognized as federates of Rome and granted territory in the western provinces of Mauritania and Numidia. It seemed briefly as though the situation might stabilize. Gaiseric, however, was not finished. In 439 AD, in a move that shocked the Roman world, Gaiseric broke the treaty and launched a surprise attack on Carthage, the greatest city in Roman North Africa, one of the most important cities in the entire empire, and the key to control of the western Mediterranean. He took it without a major battle, the city apparently unable to mount an effective defense. The fall of Carthage to the Vandals was an event of enormous strategic consequence. It gave Gaiseric control of one of Rome's most vital sources of grain and tax revenue. It gave the Vandals a magnificent harbor and a base from which to project naval power across the Mediterranean. And it gave Gaiseric the platform he needed to transform the Vandals from a migrating people into a Mediterranean power. The wandering was over. The kingdom had begun. The capture of Carthage in 439 AD marked a fundamental transformation in the story of the Vandals. For the better part of a century, they had been a people defined by movement, always pressing forward, always looking for the next foothold, always one military defeat away from dissolution. That era was now over. With Carthage in their hands and the rich agricultural heartland of North Africa at their disposal, the Vandals were no longer migrants. They were rulers. And the question that now confronted Gaiseric was not where to go next, but how to build something that would last. Gaiseric proved to be as capable a statesman as he was a military commander. The administrative infrastructure that the Romans had developed in North Africa over centuries, the tax systems, the bureaucratic apparatus, the legal frameworks, the trade networks, was largely preserved and adapted rather than dismantled. This was a pattern common among the more successful barbarian successor states of the period, and the Vandals were no exception. Roman administrative personnel continued to function in many capacities, and the machinery of governance that had made North Africa one of the empire's most productive regions was kept largely operational, now in service of the Vandal king rather than the Roman emperor. The Vandal elite, however, took for themselves the most valuable prize that North Africa had to offer, the land. The fertile agricultural estates of the province of Zugitana, the region surrounding Carthage that corresponded closely to modern-day northern Tunisia, were redistributed among the Vandal warrior class. These estates, known in Roman terminology as the sorts Vandalorum, the Vandal allotments, became the economic foundation of the Vandal aristocracy. The previous Roman landowners were dispossessed, a displacement that generated significant bitterness, and that features prominently in the hostile accounts of Roman and ecclesiastical writers of the period. The dispossessed Romans either fled, were reduced to tenant farmers on land they had previously owned, or found other ways to accommodate themselves to the new reality. Carthage itself was restored and revitalized as the Vandal capital. It was already one of the great cities of the Mediterranean world, a metropolis with a long and layered history stretching back to its Phoenician founders, through its great rivalry with Rome, to its rebuilding as a Roman colonial city. Under the Vandals, it continued to function as a major urban center. The royal court was established there, and Gaiseric governed from Carthage with an authority that was, by the standards of the age, remarkably centralized. Unlike many barbarian kingdoms of the period, in which power was diffuse, and the king was merely first among a relatively equal warrior aristocracy, Gaiseric worked deliberately to concentrate power in the hands of the monarchy and to reduce the political independence of the Vandal nobility. One of the most striking aspects of Gaiseric's statecraft was his development of naval power. The Vandals, who had arrived in North Africa as a land people with no significant maritime tradition, rapidly developed into the dominant naval force in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage's magnificent harbor facilities made this transformation possible, and Gaiseric invested in building a fleet that could project Vandal power far beyond the North African coastline. This naval capacity was not merely for show. The Vandal fleet became an instrument of both raiding and diplomacy, a tool that gave Gaiseric leverage over the major powers of the Mediterranean world that no purely land-based kingdom could have achieved. The islands of the Western Mediterranean fell, one by one, under Vandal control or influence. Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and eventually Sicily came under Vandal authority during Gaiseric's reign. These island possessions were strategically invaluable, extending the reach of the Vandal kingdom far into the sea lanes that connected the various parts of the Mediterranean world. Control of these islands meant influence over trade, the ability to threaten coastlines across a wide area, and a degree of strategic depth that made the Vandal kingdom considerably more formidable than its land area alone might suggest. The Western Roman Empire, for its part, was deeply alarmed by the rise of Vandal power and made several attempts to reassert control over North Africa. In 441 AD, a major combined expedition was assembled, drawing forces from both the Western and Eastern empires, with the intention of retaking the lost provinces. The expedition never reached North Africa. It was diverted by a Hunnic incursion in the Balkans that demanded the Eastern Empire's immediate attention. A subsequent attempt in 460 AD, launched by the Western Emperor Libius Severus, ended in disaster when the Vandal fleet destroyed the Roman armada before it could even properly engage. Gaiseric had demonstrated, with brutal efficiency, that challenging the Vandals at sea was an extremely dangerous proposition. Rome was eventually forced to accept what it could not reverse. In 442 AD, a formal peace treaty was concluded between Gaiseric and the Western Empire, in which the Romans formally recognized Vandal sovereignty over their North African territories. It was an extraordinary concession, an acknowledgement that a Germanic people who had crossed the Rhine as desperate refugees less than 4 decades earlier now held legitimate, recognized authority over some of the most valuable territory in the Roman world. The treaty was further cemented by a dynastic arrangement in which Gaiseric's son, Huneric, was betrothed to Eudocia, a daughter of the Western Emperor Valentinian III. The Vandal king was not merely a tolerated barbarian chieftain. He was a sovereign ruler whose family was now connected by marriage to the imperial house of Rome. It was a position that Gaiseric had built from nothing, through a combination of military force, shrewd diplomacy, and a strategic intelligence that few of his contemporaries could match. The Vandal kingdom was real, it was recognized, and it was for the moment secure. But Gaiseric was not a man who rested on what he had achieved. Events in Rome itself were about to provide him with both a pretext and an opportunity that he would not hesitate to seize. To understand what happened in Rome in the summer of 455 AD, we must first understand the events that immediately preceded it, because the Vandal sack of Rome was not a random act of aggression. It was, in the manner of most things Gaiseric undertook, a calculated move, and one that was deeply entangled in the internal politics of a Western Roman Empire that was by this point tearing itself apart from within. The dynastic arrangement that Gaiseric had secured through the Treaty of 442 AD, the betrothal of his son Huneric to the Roman princess Eudocia, was, in his eyes, a binding political commitment. It represented a formal link between the Vandal royal house and the Theodosian dynasty that ruled the Western Empire. Gaiseric took such arrangements with the utmost seriousness, and he expected Rome to do the same. In March of 455 AD, the the Western Emperor Valentinian III was assassinated, murdered by supporters of a Roman senator and military figure named Petronius Maximus, who then seized the throne for himself. Petronius Maximus moved quickly to consolidate his position, and among the steps he took was the arrangement of a new marriage, compelling the widowed Empress Eudoxia, Valentinian's widow, to marry him, and simultaneously breaking the existing betrothal of the princess Eudocia to Gaisaric's son Huneric, instead planning to marry Eudocia to his own son. From Gaisaric's perspective, this was an intolerable provocation. The treaty had been violated. The dynastic commitment that Rome had made to the Vandal kingdom had been unilaterally broken by a usurper who had, moreover, murdered the emperor with whom Gaisaric had made his arrangements. Ancient sources, including the chronicler Priscus, record a tradition that the Empress Eudoxia herself sent word to Gaisaric, appealing to him to intervene against the man who had effectively imprisoned her and forced her into an unwanted marriage. Whether this appeal was the primary trigger for what followed, or whether Gaisaric needed little encouragement beyond the treaty violations, is a matter of historical discussion. What is not in doubt is the result. Gaisaric assembled his fleet and sailed for Italy. Petronius Maximus, faced with the approaching Vandal armada, found that the population of Rome had little interest in dying for a man they neither liked nor respected. He attempted to flee the city and was killed by a Roman mob. Some sources say he was torn apart in the streets, before the Vandals even arrived. Rome was left leaderless and defenseless. The only figure who stepped forward to meet Gaisaric was Pope Leo I. The same Pope Leo who, 3 years earlier in 452 AD, had famously met Attila the Hun at the river Mincio and persuaded him to turn back from his advance on Rome. Leo rode out to meet the Vandal king and negotiated with him directly. According to the sources, Gaisaric agreed, in response to Leo's entreaties, that there would be no massacre of the civilian population and no burning of the city. What he did not agree to was restraint in the taking of plunder. For 14 days, from the 2nd to the 16th of June, for 55 AD, the Vandals systematically stripped Rome of its movable wealth. And the word systematically is important here, because what the Vandal sack of Rome represents, in the historical record, is not an orgy of mindless destruction, but something considerably more deliberate and organized. The Vandals went through the city methodically, removing treasures, stripping precious metals from public buildings, and loading their ships with the accumulated wealth of centuries. Among the items taken were the treasures of the imperial palace, an enormous quantity of gold and silver, and of particular historical and religious significance, the sacred treasures that the Emperor Titus had brought to Rome from the temple in Jerusalem after its destruction in 70 AD. These treasures, which had been displayed in Rome for nearly 4 centuries, were loaded onto Vandal ships and carried back to Carthage. Also taken as captives were the Empress Eudoxia herself and her 2 daughters, Eudocia, who would indeed go on to marry Gaisaric's son Huneric as originally arranged, and Placidia, who would later be ransomed back to Constantinople. This is the moment that defines the Vandals in popular memory. This is the event from which the word vandalism is ultimately derived. And yet, measured against what actually occurred, the term is in many ways a profound historical irony. The Vandals did not burn Rome. They did not slaughter its population. They did not tear down its buildings or obliterate its monuments. What they did was loot it, thoroughly, efficiently, and without remorse. But looting, as brutal and violating as it is not the same as senseless destruction. The sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455 AD was, by the standards of ancient warfare, a relatively controlled and purposeful operation. The sack of 455 AD is often compared to the more famous sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD, and the comparison is instructive. The Visigoth sack lasted 3 days. The Vandal sack lasted 14. In terms of sheer material loss, the Vandal sack was almost certainly more damaging to Rome's physical wealth. And yet the Visigoths, not the Vandals, tend to occupy the more prominent place in discussions of Rome's fall. Perhaps because the shock of 410, the first sack of Rome in 8 centuries, carried a particular psychological weight that 455 could not replicate, arriving as it did in a world already accustomed to the idea that Rome was vulnerable. Gaisaric sailed back to Carthage with his holds full and his objectives achieved. He had avenged the broken treaty. He had demonstrated, to every power in the Mediterranean world, that the Vandal kingdom was a force that could not be insulted or dismissed without consequence. He had taken the empress and her daughters as pawns to be used in future diplomatic negotiations, and he had enriched his kingdom enormously in the process. Rome would never fully recover from what was taken from it that June, and the name of the people who took it would be remembered, though not, as we have seen, entirely fairly, for as long as civilization endured. The decades following the sack of Rome represented the high-water mark of Vandal power. Gaiseric, now in the later years of a reign that had already transformed his people from desperate migrants into Mediterranean sovereigns, continued to demonstrate the strategic brilliance that had defined his leadership from the beginning. The Vandal kingdom, centered on Carthage and extending across the most fertile regions of North Africa, along with its island possessions in the western Mediterranean, was by the standards of the age a wealthy, stable, and genuinely formidable state. Gaiseric's naval dominance remained the cornerstone of Vandal power during this period. The Vandal fleet ranged widely across the Mediterranean, conducting raids on the coastlines of Sicily, southern Italy, Greece, and the eastern Mediterranean with a regularity and impunity that earned Gaiseric a fearsome reputation. The ancient sources describe a pattern of raiding that was essentially opportunistic. Vandal fleets would set sail without a fixed destination, choosing their targets based on the winds and on whatever intelligence Gaiseric's considerable diplomatic network could provide. This approach was so characteristic that it gave rise to a Latin phrase recorded in the sources. When asked where the fleet was headed, Gaiseric reportedly instructed his commanders to sail against those with whom God is angry. Whether or not he actually said this, the story captures something true about the nature of Vandal naval power in this period. It was unpredictable, wide-ranging, and deeply unsettling to everyone within its reach. The Roman world, both east and west, made further attempts to neutralize the Vandal threat during this period, and all of them failed. The most significant of these was the Great Expedition of 468 AD, an undertaking of truly enormous scale that represented the combined military effort of both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, and that stood as perhaps the last genuine opportunity to reverse the Vandal conquest of North Africa. The Eastern Emperor, Leo I, assembled what the sources describe as a massive armada, commanded by his brother-in-law Basiliscus, and dispatched it toward Carthage with the explicit objective of destroying the Vandal kingdom. The fleet that set sail was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily large. Ancient sources cite figures that modern historians treat with caution, but the expedition was unquestionably one of the largest naval operations the Roman world had mounted in generations. What happened next was one of the most consequential military disasters in late Roman history. The Roman fleet anchored off the coast of North Africa, within striking distance of Carthage, and then, for reasons that are debated by historians, with some sources suggesting bribery and others suggesting simple military caution, Basiliscus failed to press his advantage immediately. Gaiseric, characteristically, exploited the hesitation with devastating effect. He sent fire ships, vessels loaded with combustible materials, and set alight, directly into the anchored Roman fleet. The result was catastrophic for Rome. A huge portion of the fleet was destroyed, either burned or sunk or captured, and the survivors were forced into a humiliating retreat. The expedition of 468 AD, which had represented Rome's best hope of reclaiming North Africa, ended in complete and irreversible failure. The financial cost to the Eastern Empire was staggering. Ancient sources record figures that, even allowing for exaggeration, suggest the expedition consumed an almost incomprehensible amount of imperial resources. The political consequences were equally severe. After 468 AD, no serious military attempt was made to dislodge the Vandals from North Africa for the remainder of Gaiseric's reign. The Vandal kingdom was, in practical terms, unassailable. Gaiseric used this position of strength to conduct an active and sophisticated foreign policy. He maintained diplomatic contacts with multiple powers simultaneously, playing them against one another with considerable skill. He negotiated with the Eastern Empire when it suited him and raided its coastlines when that suited him better. He made and broke alliances with the various barbarian successor states that were emerging across the former territories of the Western Roman Empire. The Visigoths in Hispania and southern Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Burgundians, and others. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most capable political operators of the 5th century, barbarian or Roman. Within his kingdom, Gaiseric continued the work of consolidation. The Vandal warrior aristocracy was settled on its North African estates, and the kingdom developed the administrative and economic rhythms of a functioning state. Carthage remained a vibrant and cosmopolitan city, a center of trade and culture that continued to attract merchants, scholars, and travelers from across the Mediterranean world. The grain and olive oil of North Africa continued to flow through its port, enriching the Vandal kingdom and maintaining the commercial connections that had made the region valuable under Roman rule. Gaiseric died in January of 477 AD, having reigned as king of the Vandals for nearly half a century, an extraordinary tenure by any standard of the age. He had taken his people from the brink of destruction in Hispania, carried them across the sea, built them a kingdom, sacked Rome, neutralized every military challenge to his authority, and left behind a state that was, at the time of his death, secure and prosperous. He was, by the judgment of most modern historians who have studied the period seriously, one of the most remarkable political and military figures of the entire late antique world. A man whose achievements, had he been Roman rather than barbarian, would almost certainly have earned him a far more prominent place in the popular historical imagination. With Gaiseric gone, however, the question of what came next was an urgent one. The kingdom he had built rested to a considerable degree on the force of his own personality and the fear and respect his name commanded. His successors would inherit the structures he had created, but they would not inherit the man. And the Vandal kingdom, as the decades after Gaiseric's death would reveal, was more fragile than it appeared from the outside. To understand the Vandal kingdom fully, we cannot limit ourselves to battles, treaties, and the movements of fleets. We must also look inward at the beliefs, the culture, and the identity of the Vandal people themselves. Because the Vandals were not simply a military force moving through history. They were a society with a distinct religious identity, a cultural life, and a relationship with the Roman world around them that was considerably more complex and nuanced than the simple barbarian versus civilization narrative that has so often been applied to them. The single most important defining characteristic of Vandal identity in North Africa, beyond their ethnicity and their language, was their religion. The Vandals were Christians, but not the same kind of Christians as the Roman population they ruled over. They were Arian Christians, adherents of a theological tradition that had been declared heretical by the mainstream Roman Church at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The central point of difference between Arian Christianity and what would become Catholic Orthodoxy concerned the nature of Christ, specifically his relationship to God the Father. Arian theology held that the Son was subordinate to and created by the Father, and therefore not co-eternal or co-equal with him. The Nicene position, which became the official doctrine of the Roman Empire under Theodosius I, held that the Father and the Son were of the same substance and fully equal. This may sound, to modern ears, like an extraordinarily abstract theological dispute. In the 5th and 6th centuries, it was anything but. It was a difference that carried enormous political, social, and cultural weight. The Vandals had adopted Arian Christianity during the 4th century, as part of the broader process by which many Germanic peoples were converted to Christianity through the missionary work of figures operating in the Arian tradition. By the time they arrived in North Africa, Arianism was not merely a theological position for the Vandals. It was a fundamental marker of their identity, a way of distinguishing themselves from the Roman Catholic population they governed. It was, in a very real sense, the religious expression of their separateness as a people. The relationship between the Arian Vandal rulers and the Catholic Roman population of North Africa was, across the century of Vandal rule, a deeply troubled one. The Catholic Church in North Africa was one of the most intellectually vigorous and institutionally developed in the entire Christian world. It was, after all, the Church of Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine. It had deep roots, enormous popular support, and a clergy that was both numerous and highly educated. The Vandal kings viewed this institution with suspicion, and at various points during the kingdom's history, that suspicion hardened into active persecution. Gaiseric himself initiated policies that placed significant pressure on the Catholic Church within his kingdom. Catholic clergy were expelled from certain areas, church properties were confiscated, and restrictions were placed on Catholic worship and organization. His successors varied considerably in the intensity of their religious policies, but the underlying tension between Arian rulers and Catholic subjects never fully dissipated. The reign of Huneric, who succeeded Gaiseric in 477 AD, saw a particularly severe escalation of anti-Catholic measures. In 484 AD, Huneric issued an edict that effectively outlawed Catholic Christian practice within the Vandal kingdom, exiling bishops and clergy and confiscating church properties on a large scale. The Catholic sources from this period, most notably the Chronicle of Victor of Vida, a North African bishop who wrote a detailed account of the persecution, paint a vivid and deeply partisan picture of the suffering inflicted on the Catholic community. It is worth noting, as historians have, that the picture presented by Catholic sources requires careful handling. Victor of Vida was writing as an advocate for his persecuted community, and his account, while historically valuable, is not a dispassionate one. Moreover, it is also true that the Vandal kings did not treat all Catholics identically. Roman Catholics who cooperated with the regime, who served in administrative roles, or who demonstrated political loyalty were often treated with considerably more tolerance than those who actively resisted or criticized Vandal authority. The religious conflict in the Vandal kingdom was real and at times severe, but it was also entangled with political and social dynamics that cannot be reduced to simple religious hatred. Beyond the religious dimension, the question of how the Vandals related to the Roman culture surrounding them is a fascinating one. The evidence suggests a process of gradual but significant cultural interaction and, in some respects, assimilation. The Vandal elite, living in Carthage and on their North African estates, were immersed in a world saturated with Roman culture. Roman architecture, Roman literature, Roman legal traditions, Roman artistic conventions. Many Vandals learned Latin, which remained the language of administration and educated discourse throughout the kingdom's existence. Vandal aristocrats attended the same kinds of cultural entertainments, chariot races, theatrical performances, banquets with elaborate Roman ceremonial, that their Roman counterparts had enjoyed for centuries. The Vandals maintained their own Germanic language alongside Latin, and their own distinct customs and social practices, but the boundary between Vandal and Roman in North Africa was not a rigid wall. There was intermarriage, cultural exchange, and a blending at the edges of two worlds that had been brought into intimate contact by the accidents of migration and conquest. By the final decades of the Vandal kingdom, the distinction between Vandal and Roman in North Africa had, in some social contexts, become considerably less sharp than it had been in Gaisaric's day. The Vandal kings also patronized culture in ways that reflect this complex dual identity. The court at Carthage was home to poets and scholars, several of whom have left behind Latin works that survive to the present day. A collection of Latin poems, known as the Anthologia Latina, compiled in North Africa during the Vandal period, contains works that reflect a sophisticated literary culture operating comfortably within the Roman tradition. Vandal kings are depicted in these works in terms drawn from Roman imperial imagery, a remarkable testament to how thoroughly the Vandal rulers had absorbed and adopted the cultural vocabulary of the world they had conquered. The picture that emerges, when we look carefully at religion, culture, and identity in the Vandal kingdom, is one of considerable complexity. This was not a society of pure barbarism imposed on a helpless civilization. It was a society in the process of becoming something new, something that drew on both its Germanic roots and its Roman environment, shaped by conflict and contact in equal measure. It was like so many of the successor states that emerged from the wreckage of the Western Roman Empire, an experiment in cultural synthesis that history, ultimately, did not give enough time to complete. Kingdoms, like living things, carry within them from the very beginning the seeds of their eventual decline. For the Vandal kingdom, those seeds were sown in the decades following the death of Gaisaric in 477 AD, a period in which the structural weaknesses that his formidable personality had kept in check began, slowly and then with gathering momentum, to assert themselves. The story of the Vandal kingdom's decline is not a simple one of military defeat or external pressure alone. It is a story of internal dysfunction, succession crises, religious conflict, and a gradual erosion of the military vitality that had made the Vandals so formidable in the first place. Gaisaric, with characteristic foresight, had attempted to address the question of succession before his death. He established a system of inheritance known as the agnatic seniority principle, in which the throne would pass not from father to son in the conventional manner, but to the oldest surviving male member of the Hasding royal family. The intention behind this arrangement was to prevent the kind of destructive succession disputes that had torn apart other barbarian kingdoms, by establishing a clear and unambiguous order of inheritance that left no room for competing claims. It was a rational solution to a genuine problem. In practice, however, it created as many difficulties as it resolved. The system meant that the kingdom would be ruled by a succession of kings whose ages, abilities, and temperaments varied enormously, and who had no guarantee of having been groomed or prepared for kingship before ascending to the throne. It also meant that the royal family as a whole retained a significant collective stake in the kingdom's governance, which created ongoing tensions between reigning kings and their relatives, who were always potential successors and therefore always potential threats. The history of the Vandal kingdom after Gaiseric is, in significant part, a history of the royal family turning on itself, of kings who viewed their own kinsmen with suspicion and who responded to that suspicion with violence, imprisonment, and mutilation. Huneric, who succeeded Gaiseric and reigned from 477 to 484 AD, was a man in whom the worst tendencies of this dynamic were already visible. His reign was marked by paranoia, internal purges, and the escalating religious persecution of the Catholic population that we touched on in the previous chapter. He moved against members of his own family, whom he perceived as threats, and his court became a place of fear and intrigue. He died in 484 AD, having done considerable damage to the internal cohesion of the kingdom his father had built, and was succeeded by his nephew Gunthamund. Gunthamund, who reigned from 484 to 496 AD, represented something of a correction. He relaxed the most severe of the anti-Catholic measures that Huneric had imposed, allowing exiled bishops to return and restoring some degree of normal functioning to the Catholic Church within the kingdom. This more conciliatory approach reduced the religious tension that had been building under his predecessor, and his reign was, by comparison, a relatively stable one. But stability in this context was partly a function of reduced ambition rather than genuine strength. The Vandal kingdom under Gunthamund was less aggressive, less expansionist, and less feared than it had been under Gaiseric. The Moorish tribes of the North African interior, the indigenous Berber peoples who had coexisted with Roman and now Vandal rule, began to assert themselves more boldly during this period, raiding into Vandal-controlled territory and testing the limits of Vandal military power in ways that would have been considerably less likely in Gaiseric's day. Thrasimund, who succeeded Gunthamund and reigned from 496 to 523 AD, was by many accounts the most culturally sophisticated of the post-Gaiseric Vandal kings. He was genuinely interested in theology and engaged personally in religious debates, corresponding with learned figures on questions of Christian doctrine. He patronized culture and maintained a court that was, by the standards of the age, a place of genuine intellectual activity. He also resumed a harder line on religious policy, curtailing Catholic Church activity once again, though without the extreme violence of Huneric's reign. Thrasimund's approach to the Catholic question was less persecution than suppression. He sought to limit the Church's growth and influence rather than to destroy it outright. Militarily, however, Thrasimund's reign continued the pattern of declining Vandal effectiveness against the Moorish tribes. The tribes of the interior grew bolder and more organized during this period, and the Vandal military found itself increasingly stretched and challenged by an enemy that was difficult to pin down and defeat in conventional battle. The Vandal warrior class, settled on its North African estates for 3 and 4 generations by this point, had undergone a transformation that was perhaps inevitable but was nonetheless damaging to the kingdom's military capacity. The hard, mobile warriors who had crossed the Rhine in a frozen winter and traversed 2 continents had given way to a landed aristocracy more accustomed to the comforts of estate life than to the rigors of sustained military campaigning. The martial edge that had made the Vandals so formidable was blunting, generation by generation. The reign of Hilderic, who came to power in 523 AD upon the death of Thrasimund, brought these tensions to a head in ways that proved ultimately fatal to the kingdom. Hilderic was the son of Huneric and the Roman princess Eudocia, making him the grandson, on his mother's side, of the Western Emperor Valentinian III. This Roman blood appears to have translated into Roman sympathies that were, from a Vandal perspective, alarmingly pronounced. Hilderic reversed the religious policies of his predecessors and allowed the Catholic Church a degree of freedom it had not enjoyed for decades, convening a council of Catholic bishops and effectively ending the state's active opposition to Catholic Christianity. This was enormously popular with the Roman population of North Africa, but it alienated the Vandal warrior aristocracy, who viewed it as a betrayal of the Aryan identity that had defined their people for generations. Hilderic also proved to be a poor military leader. His forces suffered a significant defeat at the hands of the Moorish tribes, a defeat sufficiently humiliating that it shook confidence in his leadership across the kingdom. He showed little interest in the naval power that had been the cornerstone of Vandal strategic strength, and the fleet that Gaiseric had built and that had terrorized the Mediterranean for decades began to decline in effectiveness and readiness. The combination of religious alienation of the Vandal aristocracy, military failure, and what many Vandals perceived as an excessively pro-Roman orientation in the king proved too much. In 530 AD, Hilderic was overthrown in a coup led by his cousin Gelimer, who imprisoned the deposed king and seized the throne for himself. Gelimer was, in many respects, a more traditionally Vandal figure than Hilderic. He was a committed Arian, a warrior, and a man who sought to reassert the kingdom's independence and military vigor. The Vandal aristocracy that had chafed under Hilderic largely welcomed the change. But the coup against Hilderic had consequences that Gelimer did not fully anticipate. Hilderic had cultivated warm relations with the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I, and Justinian had regarded the Vandal king as something close to a friend and ally. The overthrow and imprisonment of Hilderic gave Justinian both a pretext and a motivation to intervene in North African affairs that he had not previously possessed. And Justinian, as the world was about to discover, was not a man who required much encouragement to act when opportunity presented itself. The cracks in the Vandal kingdom had been widening for decades. What was coming next would not merely widen them further. It would bring the entire structure down. By the time Gelimer seized the Vandal throne in 530 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, what historians today call the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants simply called it Rome, was entering one of the most dynamic and ambitious periods in its long history. On the throne in Constantinople sat Justinian I, an emperor of remarkable energy and vision whose overriding ambition was nothing less than the restoration of the Roman Empire in its entirety. The reconquest of the Western territories that had been lost to the barbarian successor kingdoms over the preceding century. North Africa, with its wealth, its strategic position, and its deep Roman heritage, was a natural and highly desirable target for this program of reconquest. What Justinian needed was the right moment and the right man. The right man was already in his service. Flavius Belisarius was, by any serious military assessment, one of the finest generals of the late antique world. Perhaps one of the finest commanders Rome had produced in centuries. He was still a relatively young man when Justinian turned his attention to North Africa, having already distinguished himself in campaigns against the Persians on the eastern frontier. He was disciplined, tactically creative, capable of inspiring fierce loyalty in his troops, and possessed of a calm decisiveness under pressure that made him formidable in precisely the kind of fluid, fast-moving military situations that the North African campaign would demand. Justinian chose him to lead the expedition against the Vandals, and the choice would prove inspired. The decision to launch the expedition was not made without opposition. Senior figures in the Byzantine court and military expressed serious reservations about the enterprise. North Africa was far away. The Vandals had proven themselves capable of destroying Roman fleets before, and the logistical challenges of projecting military force across the Mediterranean on such a scale were enormous. One senior official, the Praetorian prefect John the Cappadocian, argued forcefully against the expedition on practical grounds, pointing out that a previous attempt against the Vandals had ended in catastrophic failure and enormous expense. Justinian listened to these arguments and proceeded anyway. The pretext of Hilderic's overthrow, combined with the strategic prize that North Africa represented, was sufficient to override the Council of Caution. In the summer of 533 AD, Belisarius set sail from Constantinople with an expeditionary force that the sources record as comprising around 15,000 soldiers, a relatively modest number for an enterprise of such ambition, though the quality and organization of the force compensated considerably for its size. The fleet carrying this army numbered in the hundreds of ships, and the expedition also carried horses for the cavalry that would prove crucial in the battles to come. The army landed on the North African coast in late summer of 533 AD, coming ashore at a point south of Carthage and beginning its advance northward toward the Vandal capital. What happened next unfolded with a speed that surprised almost everyone, including, it seems, Belisarius himself. Gelimer had been caught badly off balance by the Byzantine landing. At the critical moment, when he needed his full military strength concentrated to meet the invasion, he had dispatched a significant portion of his forces, including his brother, Zazan, with a substantial army and fleet to suppress a rebellion in Sardinia. The timing of the Byzantine expedition, whether by design or good fortune, had caught the Vandal kingdom divided. The first major engagement between the two forces took place at a location called Ad Decimum, meaning the 10th milestone, approximately 10 miles south of Carthage, in September of 533 AD. Gelimer had devised a plan to ambush the Byzantine column from multiple directions simultaneously, using 3 separate Vandal forces to converge on the advancing army at the same time. It was a sound strategic concept, but its execution fell apart almost immediately. One of the Vandal commanders, Gelimer's nephew, Gibamund, attacked prematurely with an insufficient force and was destroyed. Another Vandal force, commanded by Gelimer's brother, Amadas, arrived at the wrong time and was similarly defeated and killed. Amadas's death appears to have had a devastating psychological effect on Gelimer, who abandoned the battle at a critical moment to attend to his brother's body rather than pressing what remained of his advantage. The Byzantine cavalry, commanded with characteristic efficiency by Belisarius's subordinates, exploited the resulting confusion and drove the Vandals from the field. The road to Carthage was open. Belisarius entered the city with his army in good order, and the sources record that his troops were under strict instructions to respect the civilian population and their property, a deliberate policy designed to win over the Roman population of North Africa and ease the transition to Byzantine rule. By all accounts, the discipline held. Belisarius dined in Gelimer's own palace that evening, reportedly using the table that had been set for the Vandal king himself, in one of the more vivid symbolic moments of the entire campaign. Gelimer had not been destroyed at Ad Decimum, merely defeated. He retreated, regrouped, and waited for the return of his brother, Zazan, from Sardinia. When Zazan arrived with his forces, Gelimer had a reunited army of meaningful strength, and he moved to besiege Carthage, cutting the city's water supply and attempting to blockade the Byzantine force within it. The decisive final battle of the campaign was fought at a place called Tricamerum, approximately 30 miles west of Carthage, in December of 533 AD, just 3 months after the Byzantine landing. At Tricamerum, the Vandal army was again defeated, and again the death of a close family member, Zazan, killed in the fighting, appears to have broken Gelimer's resolve at a critical moment. The Vandal army collapsed, and Gelimer fled westward into the Numidian interior, eventually taking refuge among the Moorish tribes in the mountains of what is today northwestern Algeria. He held out there for several months, in conditions of considerable hardship, before finally surrendering to a Byzantine officer named Faraz in the spring of 534 AD. The surrender of Gelimer effectively ended the Vandal kingdom. The remaining Vandal forces across North Africa submitted to Byzantine authority, and Belisarius returned to Constantinople with his prisoners and his plunder, including, according to some sources, the treasures that the Vandals had taken from Rome in 455 AD, among them items originally looted from Jerusalem by Titus in 70 AD. The triumph that Justinian granted Belisarius in Constantinople was the first full triumph celebrated in the Eastern Roman capital in living memory, and Gelimer walked in that triumph as the last king of the Vandals before being granted an estate in Galatia and Asia Minor and living out the remainder of his days in obscurity. The speed of the Vandal kingdom's collapse astonished contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since. A kingdom that had withstood every Roman attempt to dislodge it for nearly a century had been overthrown in less than a year by a force that was, in numerical terms, not overwhelmingly large. The explanations lie in the accumulating weaknesses we examined in the previous chapter. The declining military effectiveness of the Vandal warrior class, the internal divisions and succession conflicts that had sapped the kingdom's cohesion, the alienation of the Roman Catholic population that had made the Vandals unpopular rulers in the eyes of the majority of their subjects, and the catastrophic bad timing of having their forces split at the moment of the Byzantine landing. Belisarius was unquestionably a brilliant commander, but he was also a man who had been handed an opportunity by his enemy's weaknesses, and he was skilled enough to take full advantage of it. The Vandal kingdom, built over a century of extraordinary effort and endurance, was gone. The people who had built it were about to face a fate that was, in its own way, as remarkable as anything that had come before. The fall of the Vandal kingdom in 534 AD raises a question that is, in human terms, perhaps the most poignant of this entire story. What happened to the Vandals themselves? A people who had traveled from the shores of the Baltic Sea to the heart of North Africa, who had built a kingdom and sacked Rome and commanded the Mediterranean Sea. Where did they go when it was all over? The answer is one of history's more sobering lessons in how completely a people can be absorbed, scattered, and ultimately erased from the living world, even when their name endures in the language of civilization. The immediate fate of the Vandal population in North Africa following the Byzantine conquest was determined largely by the policies of Justinian's administration and by the practical realities of a post-conquest society. The Vandal warrior class, the military aristocracy that had formed the backbone of the kingdom, was dealt with in a manner that was by the standards of ancient conquest, not entirely without a degree of calculation and even pragmatism. Large numbers of Vandal fighting men were incorporated into the Byzantine military and dispatched to serve in other parts of the empire, far removed from North Africa. Byzantine sources record that Vandal soldiers were sent to serve on the eastern frontier in the ongoing wars against the Persian Empire. This was a policy with a dual purpose. It added capable fighters to the Byzantine military while simultaneously removing from North Africa the very people most likely to form the nucleus of any future Vandal resistance or revolt. Gelimer himself, as we noted in the previous chapter, was granted an estate in Galatia in Asia Minor. He was offered the rank of patrician, one of the highest honorific titles in the Byzantine system, but declined it, reportedly because accepting it would have required him to convert from Arianism to Chalcedonian Christianity, the Orthodox faith of the Byzantine Empire. It is a small but telling detail. Even in defeat, stripped of his kingdom and walking as a captive in another man's triumph, Gelimer retained his Arian faith. He disappears from the historical record after this point, living out his remaining years in a comfortable but irrelevant obscurity, the last king of a kingdom that no longer existed. The Vandal civilian population, the non-warrior families, the women, the children, the elderly, remained in North Africa under Byzantine rule. For them, the transition meant a change of masters rather than a physical displacement. Byzantine administration replaced Vandal administration, and the Roman Catholic Church, now free of the restrictions that had been placed on it during much of the Vandal period, reasserted itself with considerable energy. The Arian churches that the Vandals had maintained were converted to Catholic use, and the institutional structures of Arian Christianity in North Africa were systematically dismantled. Without the royal patronage and political protection that had sustained Arian Christianity in the region, it withered rapidly. The dispossessed Roman landowners, or their descendants, who had lost their estates to the Vandal sorts generations earlier, presented a complex legal and social problem for the Byzantine administration. Justinian issued legislation attempting to address the question of land restitution, though the practical implementation of such policies in a society where 3 or 4 generations had passed since the original dispossession was inevitably messy and incomplete. North Africa under Byzantine rule would spend decades working through the social and economic consequences of the Vandal interlude. What is striking, when we look at the archaeological and documentary record of North Africa in the decades and centuries following the Byzantine conquest, is how quickly and completely the Vandal presence fades from view. Within a generation or two of the conquest, the Vandals as a distinct identifiable group within North African society had effectively ceased to exist. They had no territory of their own, no political institutions to sustain a collective identity, no church to preserve their religious distinctiveness, and no royal house to serve as a symbolic focus for Vandal identity. The Arian faith that had been the most powerful marker of their separateness from the Roman population was gone. The Germanic language they had carried from Northern Europe had never displaced Latin in North Africa and had no institutional support to sustain it. One by one, the threads that had held Vandal identity together were cut, and the people simply dissolved into the broader population of the Mediterranean world. Some Vandal bloodlines continued, of course, in the biological sense. The descendants of Vandal settlers mingled with the Roman, Berber, and later Arab populations of North Africa, their ancestry gradually becoming undetectable and irrelevant to the identities of those who carried it. Vandal soldiers serving on the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire similarly left descendants who were absorbed into the populations of Asia Minor and the Near East. Gelimer's own line, had it continued, would have become indistinguishable from the Galatian population around it within a few generations. There is something almost vertiginous about this disappearance, when one considers the scale of the journey that preceded it. A people who had spent centuries in motion, who had crossed a continent and a sea and built something genuinely remarkable in the process, vanished from history in the space of a few decades, not through massacre or deliberate extermination, but through the quieter and in some ways more complete process of absorption and assimilation. The Vandals were not destroyed. They were dissolved. It is worth pausing, for a moment, to consider what was lost with them. The Vandal language, an East Germanic tongue that was a relative of Gothic, left almost no written record behind. We have a handful of names, a few glosses, and the testimony of other languages that borrowed from it. But the language itself is gone, leaving only the faintest of traces in the linguistic record of North Africa and the Mediterranean. The oral traditions, the stories, the songs, the mythology that the Vandals carried from Scandinavia through Central Europe and across 2 continents, all of it vanished without being written down, preserved by no monastery and recorded by no sympathetic chronicler. What remained was the name. And the name, stripped of its context and its complexity, attached itself to the single most dramatic moment of the Vandal story, the 14 days in Rome in 455 AD, and became a byword for destruction. The Vandals, who had been so much more than destroyers, were remembered only as destroyers. A people of extraordinary resilience and mobility, and at their best, genuine political sophistication, were reduced in the memory of civilization to a single damning syllable. History, as the Vandals discovered, is rarely kind to the defeated, and it is almost never fair to those whose story is told entirely by their enemies. We began this story in Rome, in the summer of 455 AD, with 14 days that would define a people for 15 centuries. It is fitting that we end it by returning to that question, the question that has, in one form or another, run beneath the surface of every chapter of this history. Did the Vandals deserve the reputation that history assigned them? Did they earn the word that bears their name? And what, when we step back and look at the full sweep of their extraordinary journey, is the honest verdict that a careful examination of the evidence demands? Let us first acknowledge what is true. The Vandals were not gentle. They were a warrior people operating in a violent age, and they participated in that violence fully and without apology. Their crossing into Gaul in 406 AD brought disruption and suffering to the populations they moved through. Their advance across North Africa in the late 420s and early 430s involved sieges, plunder, and the displacement of established communities. Their decades of naval raiding terrorized coastlines across the Mediterranean and brought real devastation to the people who lived on them. The religious policies of kings like Huneric caused genuine suffering to the Catholic communities of North Africa, suffering that was recorded in vivid and painful detail by those who endured it. None of this can be wished away or minimized in the name of rehabilitation. And yet, when we place the Vandals honestly within the context of their age, when we measure them not against some imagined standard of modern civilized behavior, but against the actual conduct of their contemporaries, Roman and barbarian alike, the picture changes considerably. The Romans themselves, whose civilization is so often held up as the gold standard against which the Vandals are found wanting, were perfectly capable of brutality on a scale that dwarfs anything the Vandals perpetrated. Roman armies besieged and destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and conducted campaigns of deliberate terror as instruments of policy. Roman emperors tortured and executed political rivals with a casual frequency that makes Vandal court intrigue look restrained by comparison. The violence of the late Roman world was not something the Vandals introduced. It was the water in which everyone swam. The sack of Rome in 455 AD, the act above all others that cemented the Vandal reputation, has been examined by historians with increasing care over the past century, and the consensus that has emerged is clear. By the standards of ancient siege warfare and conquest, the Vandal sack of Rome was not exceptionally destructive. There was no mass slaughter of the civilian population. There was no burning of the city. The agreement that Gaiseric reached with Pope Leo I was, by all available evidence, honored. What occurred was systematic looting, the removal of enormous quantities of portable wealth from a city that had accumulated the riches of an empire over centuries. It was devastating in terms of material loss. It was not, by ancient standards, a massacre or an act of wanton destruction. The very word vandalism, applied to the event that supposedly inspired it, turns out to be historically misleading. What the Vandals actually were, when examined honestly and in full, was something considerably more interesting than the caricature that their name has become. They were a people of remarkable resilience, a group that survived pressures and dislocations that destroyed other peoples entirely, that adapted to radically different environments with impressive flexibility, and that maintained enough internal cohesion to make the extraordinary journey from Scandinavia to North Africa without fragmenting beyond recovery. They were, under Gaiseric, capable of producing political and military leadership of genuinely exceptional quality. Leadership that outmaneuvered the greatest empire in the Western world for decades and built a kingdom that lasted nearly a century. They were, in their North African incarnation, a society that sustained urban culture, patronized Latin literature, engaged seriously with the theological questions of their age, and administered a complex and wealthy territory with sufficient competence to keep it functioning for 100 years. They were also, it must be said, ultimately unable to solve the central problem of their kingdom's existence. The problem of integrating a small Aryan Germanic ruling class with a large Roman Catholic subject population in a way that created genuine social cohesion rather than permanent underlying tension. This failure was not unique to the Vandals. It was a challenge that every barbarian successor state of the period faced, and most of them struggled with it. But in the Vandal case, the failure to bridge that gap, the persistent separateness of Vandal identity, maintained through religious distinctiveness, landowning privilege, and social exclusivity, meant that when the military crisis came in 533 AD, there was no deep reservoir of popular loyalty to the kingdom to draw on. The Roman population of North Africa watched the Byzantine conquest with, at best, ambivalence, and at worst, active relief. The legacy of the Vandals, then, is a paradox. Their name is one of the most widely known in the popular vocabulary of Western civilization, recognized across languages and cultures as a synonym for destruction. And yet the people behind that name are almost entirely unknown to the general public. The word has outlasted the history. The caricature has outlasted the reality. A people who traveled further, endured more, and achieved more than almost any other group of their era are remembered, when they are remembered at all, for 14 days out of a story that spans centuries. It has been time for a long while, to remember them more fully. Not to romanticize them, not to excuse the suffering they caused, but to see them as they actually were, a people caught up in forces larger than themselves, doing what peoples in extremity have always done, moving, fighting, adapting, building, until the world finally closed around them and they were gone. The Vandals deserve more than a word. They deserve a history. And now, at last, you have one. If you found this journey through the full history of the Vandals as compelling as we hope you did, please consider subscribing to Ancient Odyssey. Every subscription helps us continue bringing the forgotten and misunderstood stories of the ancient world to light. Stories that deserve to be told with the care, the depth, and the seriousness they have always merited. Hit the subscribe button, join our growing community of history enthusiasts, and stay with us, because the ancient world still has many stories left to tell, and we are only just getting started.